Welcome to another episode of Money for Nothing, the podcast about music and capitalism. I'm Saxon and I'm with Sam Backer as always. Today we're doing a little two-parter for you. First, we're going to jump into Luminate's mid-year music report just came out.
Eagerly anticipated.
Yeah, offers all the latest trends regarding sales and listening habits, and we're going to try to unpack what that all means, and particularly the focus on super fans. Not just a fan, a super fan. And in the second half, we're going to dive into Hollywood's writers plus actors strike, see what that's all about, and think on the ways some of the complaints and existential threats relate to the music industry. Before we get started, please rate and review us and follow us on all the socials. We got a newsletter that comes out every now and then, and you should probably read it. And you can subscribe to it at moneyfornothing.substack.com. So come sign up. Okay, so to dive in, we're starting with the Luminate mid-year music report, which Luminate is like a data and insight company. And each year around summer, they drop a report to detail the trends in the music industry. And as usual, there's a lot to talk about in this extensive report. And
yeah,
so that's exactly what we're doing.
It's
Okay,
interesting
so we went
because
through
there's
it
very few
with like a fine-tooth comb.
Like data sources.
And I guess what
about, right?
you know,
And
we were mentioning
Luminate
super
is one
fans,
of
but what are some of the things that stood out to you,
few,
Sam?
Like the fields of raw data that provide everyone else's talking points forever. And so like there's a bunch of like various like facts and figures that were interesting, but like one of the primary ones is what you were saying, this idea of super fans as driving engagement. And I think that we wanted to talk about it because it fits, I think, really nicely with this kind of broader new focus from the industry on changing the way that people think about what's valuable in music listenership, right? So we talked a couple episodes ago about universal music kind of throwing its weight around, and thinking about if streaming were going to change, how is it going to change, and maybe not valuing all streams the same. And I think this report is part of a similar discourse, right? Which totally makes sense if you think about the evolution of streaming in its core markets. Like the US is saturated with streaming. There's not that much streaming growth. Europe is fairly saturated. I mean, according to this report, there was a 50% increase in streaming in Europe in the last year, which like seems to me to be hard to believe if you think about, I don't know, England or France or Germany. But I think generally like what you're seeing is kind of a sense that there's a limit. There's peak stream, right? And various places are hitting peak stream. And once you've hit peak stream, there's a question of like, okay, if these companies have promised us unlimited growth forever, and that growth is beginning to slow, or at least its the rate of growth is beginning to slow. How are you going to make more money? And so beginning to like disaggregate listenership and focus on certain subsections of listeners and how they consume music in its increasingly diverse set of commodity streams is really interesting, both for what it says about like where the music industry might go and for what it says about, I guess, music as a commodity form.
Yeah, and it surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, the vinyl sort of boom that we've been seeing, I guess, I don't know, what, like probably over a decade now, is like just continuing to go strong, and is actually like now being picked up by a Gen Z, essentially.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, it's definitely crossed, and maybe even accelerated as it crossed the generation gap. That like it's not just rapidly aging millennial hipsters in Williamsburg. It's like your average Gen Z listener, or maybe not average, but certainly your super fan Gen Z listener is buying vinyl from their favorite artists, and not just vinyl, is buying a variety of various types of goods from their favorite artists. So maybe it's worthwhile, before we keep talking about this longer, is to kind of identify what this report says a super fan is.
Maybe just to like give you some quick numbers though before we dive into that. Just like, yeah, you know, vinyl LP sales were up 21%, and this is like the 17th consecutive year that vinyl has seen a rise in sales. So yeah, But like, yeah, so you wanted to go ahead, and basically what you're saying is that fans or super fans are actually buying physical commodities. They're like not happy with just streaming Taylor Swift or streaming Morgan Wallen. Like they want a physical commodity of music from these artists, unsurprisingly.
And I think that's like, well, you said it was surprising or wasn't?
I said unsurprisingly. I mean, like, I think, going back to like our critique of like NFTs, it's like, I was actually texting you last night about how this guy walked up to me in a bar because he happened to hear that like I do some artwork, and he was like trying to pitch me NFTs, and I'm like, he's like, because people like to own things, they like to like have something, and like he's right, but they actually want a physical object, not a file on their computer. But anyways, yeah. So I mean, it's in a way, it's like it's not surprising to me at all, but I think that maybe it being not just like general merch, but actually like being like vinyl is maybe like a little, what I'm saying is kind of surprising. And the fact that it's like jump generations at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I do want to push back a little bit on what you just said, though, because you were like, they want to buy a physical music as a physical commodity. And I actually don't think, and this is where I get way over my skis as like a Gen Z whisperer, because, what do I know? But, and like, not to mention that like generations are kind of bullshit anyway. That said, I actually do think that there's a change. I think that the like 90s, early 2000s discourse about music is that like, yeah, people wanted a physical commodity for music. And I actually don't think that that's what's driving this exactly, right? I don't think that, but people want physical commodities. People want to engage with these artists that give their life meaning via cultural performance, via cultural symbolism, and they want to engage with them across multiple, like in multiple ways. But I actually don't think it's about a physical commodity for music. I think it's like I actually don't know if the music part of the vinyl matters as much. Right? Like there's a lot less of that like discourse, and maybe just because it's like old hat at this point, but no one's like, it's vinyl because it sounds so good. It's like vinyl. It's like, it's more, it seems to me to be more about like vinyl because it allows you to like physically position, and also partially by like symbolically position because you're spending the cash on a thing, the importance of this act or this community in your life, right? So it's like
I wasn't disagreeing with that. I mean, I wasn't saying that people were buying vinyl because of the fact that it sounds better. I think it's because like you are a super fan and like you have the shirt and you have the hat and you have the like specialty whatever and you have the signed ticket and you have the photo and you just want to continue to accumulate objects, commodities to express or show or to feel closer to like that superstar.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's a big change, actually, like a subtle but big change of the vinyl revival over time.
Yeah. So what you're saying is basically that maybe like the earlier discourse was that like, oh, vinyl sounds better, the sort of high fidelity kind of snobby, stereotypical music collector, who then like, once a month, goes and like DJs his deep collection at like a cool like cocktail bar in Brooklyn. It's like not so much really about that anymore.
I feel personally attacked.
Yeah. Well, you should maybe actually DJ more because you do have like over 1 billion records. No, but like
you heard it here first.
Yeah. but like now, yeah, what you're saying is that it's not so much that now. It's really kind of what I was just saying, where it's like it's more just one more thing that's like a part of stuff to collect, maybe, that express that fandom.
Yeah, and so really quickly, just to be nailed down our terminology, according to this report, a super fan is someone who engages with a musical artist across kind of like multiple mediums or vectors, and specifically someone who engages with a musical artist via like 5 or more ways. Now, like I imagine someone that's like listens to them, follows them on Twitter, follows them on Instagram, bought a shirt, sees them live, etc. But I do think, in a weird way, just going back to what you're saying, if you think about like why these people are doing this, that in some ways maybe in a weird, like the same discourse that existed among kind of like the musical snob community in the early 2000s about, oh, vinyl is more real, having a physical object of the music makes it more real. As kind of music, and we've talked about this a lot, is kind of like bursting away from its relationship to like a specific set of culture carrying commodities and like expanding out to like this broader, more amorphous web of social media and other things. It's almost like people maybe want physical instantiations of their identities, given the fact that like so much of internet-based identity can be like so fungible. It's so hard to know who people are, what they like, what their histories are, that like having that like the solidity provided by buying 9 copies of a Taylor Swift album is really appealing to people.
So what you're trying to say right now, like if I understand, is that this helps solidify and clarify their sort of how they shape their identity as it's presented, both obviously in person, but mainly like online?
Or that like, it wouldn't surprise me if the ways that people have been shaping their identity online can begin to feel a little bit like amorphous, given how important that those online identities are, as they're like more than half of people. You know what I mean? Like you could imagine like a tipping point where it's like everything's online. And we've talked before about spaces where like Instagram is more real than whatever is actually happening in the street. And I could imagine like physical commodities and expressions of physical commodity, like actually putting your money where your mouth is. If you're in the kind of like discourse driven environments of the internet, the sense of like reality that, no, I spent $500 on this thing or these things, that being really appealing to people.
I'm actually not so sure I fully agree with what you're saying, and I might be like, maybe I'm misinterpreting it. But I think that actually we're at a point now in culture and society where we've kind of normalized the sort of categorization of our identities because we're forced to describe it in so many ways, oftentimes through our consumers' habits and our purchasing habits. So if you're on a dating app, outside of like the bio, you know, there's like all these prompts and like categories in which you can go ahead and like click that like are basically just like, yeah, sometimes maybe just your day-to-day habits, but also generally are like related to some sort of consumerism that is somehow supposed to then help the people who are swiping understand you more. And this goes all the way back to, I say, like, you know, early days of social media when it comes to like MySpace, where, you know, like, what's the music you like? You got to make a list. What's the bio? What's this? Where you from? All this stuff. So I actually think that it's like, maybe it is that to a certain extent, but I actually think it might be like sort of an extension of that, because I think it's quite normal now for people to like have to try to attempt to differentiate themselves from the other 2D square photo of someone, whether it be like on Instagram or a dating app or like some sort of like Facebook. I think they're quite used to that, but maybe this is like an extension of that, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know how much like the actual like owning a physical commodity is something that also extends outward to one's online presence, but I do think that it does obviously like
I'm saying it's like a counterbalance. It's like a counterbalance almost. It's like people are so used to presenting themselves in these ways that can feel unsatisfying that maybe it's like, I bought all of this stuff from this cultural icon who's important to me, and that like allows me to like anchor my identity in a way that just, you know, you're a Lady Gaga fan and you say it on Bumble. I'm a Lady Gaga fan and I say it on Bumble. There's no way for me to like ascertain the extent to which you're really a little monster, but like I have all of these things, and so I can like firmly, it like helps me orient myself within this community.
Yeah, I think maybe that's it. It's like sort of a way of like actually like connecting with someone or like other people, like this sort of like, I think that's it. It's like the sort of alienation, the isolation, and the atomization that just generally being continually online and on one's phone causes. This is a way to sort of like take it to the next level and like be a part of some sort of vague community that's real and there, and then you see them all at the Taylor Swift concert.
Or
but,
like connect,
you know, kind
with
of
yourself. You know, I feel like maybe that's even more, right? Like, because no one can actually tell if the Taylor Swift albums that you have in your picture are actually yours if you Photoshop, right? The thing that matters is to you at some level. Like, you know, and that allows you to orient yourself, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Regardless of the motivation and the reasons why, it's something that it's a growing trend. And I think it's also related to another trend that we saw in this report, that like direct to consumer sales are up 20% in the last year, which is just kind of interesting that like, I guess a lot of that also has to do with like direct sales from like, say, like TaylorSwift.com, getting like something that's like exclusively from that artist. But I'm also kind of curious, like what you think about this in regards to, I'm curious what you kind of think about this in regards to like the role of like the superstar now, because it does because something we've also kind of also talked about is that it's like a lot more difficult now for the music industry to produce like the Michael Jacksons and the Bruce Springsteens. Do you feel like this is kind of like a pushback against that sort of thesis?
Yeah, I mean, this data doesn't tell us. That's a really, really interesting question. And I think that the thing that would be indicative of that is like, you could break down, if you had a graph that presented like number of sales, the percentage of sales, direct-to-consumer sales or merchandise sales or physical commodity sales in general in relationship to the like size and popularity of the artist, you know? Like, is this being driven by a handful of tentpole artists that clearly can have mass cultural impact? Or is this like your mid-sized Midwestern cities biggest hardcore band is like selling a lot of direct to consumer merch? And I don't know, and this data doesn't tell us, but I think it'd be really interesting to see if this is about like these massive and like massively affective communities of fans. Like, we keep bringing up Taylor Swift, but that's because like and of course it's to a certain extent media driven, but like the impact of the Eras tour has been crazy, and been crazy for the people participating in it. Like, I don't know if you've seen like the videos of like the subway cars or like the auditoriums where it's just like all women of a certain age and there's like 6 dudes in the crowd, and they're just like, oh, I realized that I wasn't afraid in this crowd, right? Like, people are having profound experiences with these massive phenomena that I think that you'd have to be crazy to like not take seriously. And so the question is like, is it the superstars, or is it a broader sea change in the way that people are interacting with music? I mean,
interesting. Well, I also think it also relates to like kind of another trend, and I didn't mean to interrupt if you have more to say, but like another trend that we see, which is just like, you know, the rapid growth of like non-English lyric music. And I can't think of like K-pop and the sort of fandom that we see, and the super fandom that we see around K-pop starting to like maybe like directly, maybe not directly. And like you said, maybe it's something more to do with like the current cultural climate. But like, I think that like the sort of fandom that we're seeing around this Eras tour does seem to like be very similar to like what we see like in K-pop and the fandom there. I mean, coming from different places, and obviously as we've learned on the K-pop episode that we did, like it's much more complex. It's almost kind of a mix of like almost like sports fandom, maybe. I don't know, but I don't know. I do see this being like a sort of similarity there. I mean, am I crazy for that?
No. And I think that sense that like there's a broader model for this, and that certain kinds of fan practices are moving out, being replicated both by fan communities, right? That I think that clearly, like, whether or not K-pop has like peaked as an American phenomenon, various people have various views on that. And you can listen to our 2 episodes ago to kind of hear about how some of the major K-pop record companies / talent agencies are negotiating these changes. I think that the example of these hyper organized communities and the level of fan engagement, I can't but believe like influenced other fan communities. It's like, whoa, there's a level more intense of fandom and fan organization and ways to organize your life with and through and around fandom. And I imagine that's both functioning at like a grassroots level, but also at like a record company level. Because I think that for companies that are beginning to imagine the limits of streaming payouts, that K-pop is a really good example of how you create a commoditized universe for interactions, right? Like, the idea that people are paying a subscription in order to get the opportunity to buy tickets is like, that's printing money. That's beautiful, baby, right? Like, imagine if every fan if like every fan of a large artist in America belonged to a $10 a month fan club, right? Just so they had the opportunity, the honor to maybe see Morgan Wallen live. Like, that's a lot of money. And a lot of ways of kind of creating, as you like to say, like new touch points for these artists. And so I do think a lot of this stuff is emanating, or at least related, whether it just in terms of like K-pop got to it first or direct influence, but I do think that is a model that we're going to be seeing more of.
And I mean, I think it'd be pretty silly not to think that like managers of Taylor Swift or like C-suite executives at like Universal are like seeing like how K-pop like operates and being like, how do we fucking replicate that shit here?
Yeah. And like also thinking about, and this is another part of what Luminate argues about these super fans, is that they're influential, right? That they're able to. The people who are very involved in an artist are more likely not just to go see them themselves, but to like having these like almost like shock troops for
like it's like a street team.
Yeah, basically, it's like a street team, and certainly in a very manipulable chart environment where having a number one song can get you more attention, like. The kinds of things that, again, K-pop fans figured out how to do to like boost their acts to number one, like in some ways, like hacking the chart informational complex, we might call it the Billboard complex. That's actually really efficacious in terms of like forwarding their artists' careers, which I guess like is how I maybe want to wrap up this segment of the show, because I'm really interested to hear your thoughts, Saxon, on like what it means for almost like commoditization for the sake of commoditization, like buying things for the sake of having bought things, which is like one way to read like some of these purchases, like what that tells us about, I don't know, what music means in people's lives and what that tells us about like music, right? That like just listening to the music isn't enough, that something is clearly lacking when you're just streaming an artist, and that people want more, but that it's like being mediated so effectively through consumer oriented commodities.
This should go down like a real rabbit hole, and like I feel like my take is like a little bit dark actually, and like kind of a bummer maybe. But it's I heard one time, and I because I take terrible notes, I can't remember who wrote it, but someone one time I read wrote that when a society or like when you're in a community that doesn't like validate like who you are and like value like you as a person, and like then like what we oftentimes do is we turn to chasing fame, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing. And I think that like, I don't know, that's the first thing that came to my head here, where it's like these fans aren't obviously chasing fame per se, but they are trying to constantly in some way get closer to, if not actual Taylor Swift, or maybe we should stop using her as an example, but Morgan Wallen, that there is this sort of desire to at least get closer to, or a part of like the myth that surrounds this sort of stardom, and to like have like a little bit of that like mythical star power fairy dust like fall on your like head. And I think, obviously that's mediated through buying shit and commodities, right? And then of course like the capitalist way is that like, market begets market, right? So I mean, there's the great like, and really dating myself here, but there's that great scene in Spaceballs when the sort of fake like Yoda character that's played by Mel Brooks, like suddenly there's like this scene where in the middle of the movie you're watching Spaceballs has this sort of reflexive moment where it's like merchandise, Spaceballs the lunch pail, Spaceballs the doll, Spaceballs like all this stuff. And it's just like, I mean, that was like in the 80s, right? But it's like they're gonna continue and capitalize this on as much as possible. And like you said, if we plateaued, or maybe not plateaued, but like streaming has kind of like has like a limited amount to offer. And since like, let's be real, the fucking failures of NFT to satisfy super fans, although maybe they do have Morgan Wallen shirtless NFT gifts, I don't know, possibly,
Send them, please.
Yeah, please send them. Yeah. People are going to chase after this kind of stuff, and I think to go full circle, to go back to the original quote I said, is that I think that oftentimes even the fact that we're like mediating our identities like through someone else's fame and stardom, through their merchandise, and this isn't to like take away, reflects, let me finish the sentence, it reflects on maybe like the state of like where us as a subject in a capitalist society is, in the sense that we're continuing to feel more atomized and more lonely and more not a part of any kind of community, or we've never even known what it is to be a part of like a really like strong community. And so we like are like just almost naturally as human beings reaching out towards these groups of people and these super fans. And in doing so, the only way that maybe we know how, if we're like a 16-year-old who's only known this as their like real reality, as their reality, then like we're going to go ahead and just buy shit because that's how we're taught. That's how that's how we like shape our identities now. I mean, this is nothing new. And I just think it's fascinating that despite this like heavily technological world where we're like constantly on our screens and constantly online, that there is this still return to the mythical, the myth of the object, right? Like, I don't know, thinking about like Benjamin or whatever, or like Marx, it's just fascinating that it's still there. It's still there, to have that limited edition, whatever, to have that physical thing, to, whatever we're saying, whether it's like define your identity, to be a part of community, whatever it may be. But I do want to add though, that that's not to take away from like the magic of the music, right? Which, I mean, I'm not taking away from the real emotional connection that these millions of fans are making and have when they hear a Taylor Swift song. And I've actually talked to, not to keep rambling here, but just to finish up what I was saying, like, I don't really get Taylor Swift, like we've talked about this, but like I've talked to younger people who are really into Taylor Swift, and what oftentimes comes up is that they talk about how she speaks to their experience. So I mean, that's another thing, that, I mean, like, okay, that's interesting, because I mean, what I just talked about, like that experience. So maybe like you can't ignore the importance of the music, is what I'm saying, is that like these lyrics and this sound in a increasingly like alienated, isolated society is making them feel a connection even when they are alone listening to it on a bus or at home or whatever, regardless of like the millions of fans that are also doing it. They feel a connection to Taylor and what she's singing about, or Morgan. So I mean, yeah, I can't, what I said earlier about, I don't want to take away from the music and the connection, and that does seem to be actually the conduit, the kind of that connects all of this. And obviously we can go down a long path about what music was and what music is now in a commodified form, which we've done a little bit, but we'll save it for this episode. I do just want one last point on this that I think is really interesting also, that I kind of love, is the irrationality. Right.
And I mean that, I mean that in terms, if you think about like a lot of commodity purchases, of course there are, there's your base ones, right? You need food, you need shelter. Then there's a lot of times like there's the myth of progress, right? Like, this car is better, it will fulfill this need, this toaster is better, this espresso machine is better. And then there's often also like somewhat competitive distinction, like, this jacket is cooler, these shoes are limited edition. And in kind of the neoliberal, like the malignant neoliberal version of this, is like, not only do these shoes make me different, but if I keep them in the box, they're also an investment opportunity. And what's cool about this consumption, as far as I can tell, is that it's kind of not that in the same way, right? It's not like I'm flaunting. I'm buying this to be part of something, more than I'm buying this because it's limited and rare and you don't have it.
I think that's true. And it's like, unfortunately, it's like, yeah, go ahead.
And it's not about progress either, right? It's not like I'm buying this because it's a better version of the thing. It's like, I'm, in some ways, it like reveals in this weird, like, we've come all the way around maybe, that like money is symbolic, and money's purpose is to allow us to like at a fundamental like core human meaning making level, like symbolically orient ourselves in the world. Like that's what human beings need, is they need symbolic orientation through like totemic objects, and money can be that, but also like these goods are like magical in the realist sense, and like that the idea that money's truest purpose is to allow you to symbolically, is like the best thing you can spend it on is healthcare and totems, is like a wild place to end up in 2023.
And it's where we fucking do politics still. I mean, like the whole debate around like gas stoves and like electric stoves. I mean, I saw this exhibit at the Whitney recently by this artist named Josh Klein, and he was kind of like trying to explore this idea around how America is divided maybe right or left or whatever through like purchases, and he had actually like taken physical items like the gas stove and an electric stove, and he had like somehow split it right down the middle and then welded them together to kind of showcase that conflict. And there was like everything from like, you know, the iPhone versus like an Android phone, and then like a, you know, like a Vitamix versus like whatever, you know, another kind of blender, as like, and it's like it seems so silly, but yet it is. It's like, it's how we kind of, it's so wrapped up in like every part of our existence.
It's real. It's real. It's like, you realist.
Yeah, right. You listen to Morgan Wallen, like that is a, like, it's not just because you love his music and he speaks to you and like you're a super fan. It like actually is like, can like carry over into like your identity as like an individual in the United States, and like what that means as far as like, you know, socially, like urban or rural, like right or left, religiously, like it's all carried over just because you go to his concert and you're a fan. It's all wrapped up, and like, and then of course that just extends out to the commodities as well. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. Well, on that note, we're gonna go ahead in the second half pivot to the writer's strike. So, as you probably have heard, Writers Guild of America, who basically make up all the writers in Hollywood, went on strike in early May. It's still going on, and recently was joined by SAG-AFTRA. AFTRA? Yeah, AFTRA. Yeah. The union that represents actors and other media professionals in Hollywood. And the beef stems from an ongoing labor dispute with the Alliance of Motion Pictures and Television Producers, or AMPTP, over a number of issues. There's a whole bunch of issues here, and a lot of them are quite existential. Do you want to go ahead and like run through kind of just a basic sort of like background of like what the issues are and like where the strike stands, and maybe a little bit of history, and then we can dive into like how it relates to music?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so basically, folks listening to this podcast are probably also paying attention to this like biggest labor story in the last decade of American life, maybe. Except when like Congress goes on strike because they refuse to fund themselves. And yeah, it's crazy. So like the writers last struck in like 2007, 2008, something like that. Which kind of came and went, produced some fabulous late night TV. But the last time everyone struck, and so the writers and the actors, was in the 60s when, believe it or not, union leader Ronald Reagan
yeah, why? It's so weird. It's so strange. So
was
weird.
The head of SAG-AFTRA. And basically that was about, those strikes were about the massive changes to Hollywood and being brought on by television. And the ways in which artists were or were not being adequately compensated for their work, as everyone really started to realize what a massive geyser of cash TV was going to be. And it created, in a series of very complicated negotiations over a long period of time, and as is often true in these things, the actors settle first, partially because like everyone knows who they are, and they have more leverage. And it took the writers a lot longer to get my understanding is, a somewhat worse deal. But basically, like, there was enough power in that strike to really fundamentally reshape at a basic level how the industry was going to function. And the biggest thing to come out of it was the creation of residuals, right? This idea that when reruns of your things that you worked on were played, because, right, there's no performance royalty or mechanical reproduction royalty the way there is in music. When your TV show when your TV show was replayed, or when your movie appeared on TV, like, you'd get paid again. So all of those stories of like Seinfeld making actors on Seinfeld making millions of dollars years later are based on the residuals, right? This idea that if you get a show into reruns, you were set basically for life. And like, if you're small, and I also think that in terms of like the middle, quote unquote, middle class, right? If you had like a small part on a show, you'd not making millions, but you could get a steady stream of income that would help you along with all the other new pieces that, you know, in that kind of like elevated freelancer lifestyle that like character actors in Hollywood make, right? You could kind of piece together a real living, a middle class living for a lot of these actors. And the sense is that both of these strikes are happening at the same time, because there's been a series of structural changes in the TV and film industries, and that as Hollywood is, I would say, like, as it's moving forward into this next decade, as things are getting rougher as a result of changed financial conditions, like macroeconomic financial conditions, it's like, now is the time to figure out what this next period is going to look like. Because for a lot of these writers, they feel like what had been a solid gig, what had been a solid way of life that was also tremendously culturally productive, right, was slipping out of their grasp. And so, like, different sectors have different kinds of critiques, but a lot of this is being driven by kind of like the elephant in the room, which are these new fully integrated streaming services that, because Netflix, right? And Netflix, which is important, not just because they didn't just financialize like Hollywood, which has already been financialized, but I don't know if there's a verb form of turned into a tech valuation, techified, made tectonic.
What they disrupted?
Yeah, they disrupted the system, and they disrupted the system by kind of creating giving themselves access to infinite capital to just like burn money by producing all kinds of shows and products that they didn't have to then having a kind of closed system. So unlike a movie, which has a box office, Netflix could spend movie level money on shows and then not have to like let anyone know the audience numbers, and pushed in like first time as tragedy, second time as farce rerun of the pivot to video that destroyed journalism. Basically, all these entertainment companies were like, oh yeah, the Netflix model, that's the way to do it. And have like tried to follow to make it so their valuations, their stock valuations would be understood as a tech company and not as like a relatively stable business that has an actual bottom line and an actual like profit and loss statement that you could understand. Maybe not understand. That is a wild simplification of the kind of tax chicanery that Hollywood has always done. But like a profit or loss statement that somewhere existed in the world, rather than like a company that's based entirely on like vibes and tech vibes. And like, yeah, like things like how many subscribers do you have like matters for the vibes, but like it's all vibes at the bottom. And so like, because of that, because of changes that kind of are emerging out of that, you're having increasingly tight labor conditions. As the promise of that pivot has started to fall away, you're getting less and less money thrown away, desires by these companies to cut the bottom line, the change to digital production has created all kinds of like new labor conditions. So you get really small writers' rooms. You've got way fewer episodes being produced. So actors, even if they're being paid like on a per appearance rate, like can get paid less a lot of times. You've got weird seasons.
No residuals.
No residuals.
Or like lack of residuals.
Or very, very, very little residuals from places like Netflix, because there aren't seasons exactly. They aren't rerun. They're on demand. You're also getting like, just in terms of like the rise of precarity in the sense that like shows are 8 seasons long, and they'll be like, you're on a show, you run through the show. It's maybe there's a next season next year. Maybe it's in 3 years. All kinds of, and then like you're stuck in a contract and you can't get out of it and you don't know what's happening. And just so that all of that was before, I think, the threat of AI that's not quite here yet, but is certainly coming in terms of what that could do to writers, what that could do to actors, especially like as we've seen relatively unsatisfying, but like increasingly effective use of.
I would even disagree. Like actually, like did you happen to see the Bruce Willis like Russian telephone like AI?
No, I didn't.
It's like really good. It's like scary good, and that happened 2 years ago.
Yeah, or like spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian, right, where they have, it was the first effective use I've seen of that, where I don't know if you saw it, Saxon, you probably didn't, but like at the end of season 2, like Luke shows up and it's like young Luke, and like for a plot device, he's not on screen for very long, but it's like a very effective, like Luke Skywalker shows up and you're like, oh shit, it's Luke. And like, no, it's not, and it's like Luke looking like he did at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, basically. And so it's wild. And yeah, and these things are gonna continue accelerating, as is the way of all flesh, digital or otherwise.
I think one of the reasons, and I think the reason why we wanted to talk about this, you might be asking yourself, like, how exactly does this relate to music? And I think the first thing to bring up is just a lot of the sort of issues or the existential crisis that's at hand here that's inherently fueling this strike are, if not the same, like extremely similar to the complaints and the worries that we've been hearing for like almost now a decade from musicians about lack of payouts, increasing in like AI, like generated, music, the algorithms, the lack of like transparency,
doing more things for less money.
And it sucks to say that. Oh yeah. Or like, the consolidation of like the major labels, which is also kind of like, not the direct complaint, but is like contributing to a lot of this. Like, and it sucks to say this, but like the lack of a fucking union is like screwing over the musicians. And that's like one advantage, and we'll see how this all ends up, but that's one advantage that like the Writers Guild and the actors can do, is that they have an unusually highly unionized, strong union that can just like stop work, down tools, as they say.
Yeah. And it's even interesting that there's like clear the power imbalance between the two of them, right? Like the writers, like no one knows who they are. Like sure, it's like Stephen King on the picket line, but like what does Stephen King look like? You don't know it the same way if I say Brad Pitt. Like Brad Pitt is on strike. I mean, look, the Fran Drescher is the head of the union now. Like it's crazy.
I know, it's great. I love it. I know, it's so perfect.
Yeah. So it's I think maybe like you said, Saxon, like just the opportunity to sit back and think about the structural differences that these forms of organization make in terms of potentially laying out the playing field for what happens next. Because I think that one of the big differences that's happening in this story versus what's happening when we talk about big changes in the music industry, right, is like technology's impacting all of these media, right? And technology allows new players. It makes old forms of payout structures increasingly ineffective. It undercuts prior powers, does all kinds of stuff, right? And so every so often, right? Like, and one of the things that like I think that we have kind of been discovering as doing the research for this podcast is the ways in which it's sure, culture has like gradual evolution, but it also has these moments of like dramatic structural discontinuity when new laws get passed, new agreements get made that like create a new landscape that then everyone kind of negotiates and manipulates to the best of their abilities. And so like recently we've talked about the potential moves that the major labels are making to shake up the streaming ecosystem that they sort of accidentally created, the rules of the streaming ecosystem that they sort of accidentally created in 2008, 2009, right? That they're starting to negotiate with the companies. They're maybe thinking about new laws to like change from a raw payout streaming system to one that values different kinds of engagement or that values different kind of music differently. And at some level, that's the kinds of negotiations that are happening in the in the film industry right now, right? And those are also the kinds of negotiations that happened in the 60s with the last ones of the strikes where residuals got created. And it's just crazy to see, instead of a version of a creative industry like the music industry, where like the power players are the major labels, the streaming companies, the tech companies, Congress, to have another force there that can speak for labor, that just is able to say like, no, we need this law passed. We need this agreement made. And it's fascinating because it's from like even from a purely business perspective, right? A vision of the music industry where basically it's not, put it this way, it's not in the music industry's best interest to make it so that no one can make a living making music, because if they do that, there will be less good music. You actually want, and we've talked about this a lot, right? You want like a healthy creative economy so that you get good music made. And in places when there's a healthy creative economy, they make more music, they make more innovative music, and it's more profitable. And in countries and situations where that economy falls away, it's very hard to like generate, from a purely business perspective, generate profits. And in like, I guess we're not telling anyone anything particularly new here. It's like capitalism isn't always the best at organizing in its own best interests, right? Like in the people will take and companies will take like short-term measures that destroy the ground on which they stand. I mean, like, look at humanity right now. Literally, like, in every single sector related to climate change, literally destroying the ground on which they stand. And that's, I would argue, like, to a certain extent, what is maybe happening in the film industry. And what's fascinating, and there's some great coverage about the ways that is, whether that's the incredible concentration of theater ownership, which makes, instead of like slow burning hits that allow like more new, relatively unknown projects to slowly gain word of mouth steam. I saw this amazing article that we can link to in the show notes, that there hasn't been a new comedy series launched since like 2012 with the Hangover. And part of it just the theaters are so concentrated that you need a huge opening weekend, and then there's a sharp tail off, which means that anything that's going to open on thousands of theaters across the country needs name recognition, versus movies like, I don't know, Back to the Future, which opened on some screens, got word of mouth, slowly gained popularity, and like had a gradual build. And so you actually get like changes in the composition of the art form in ways that are bad for the art form. And it's just crazy to see an industry where, because of union power, because of the very specific histories and like solidarities, there's another force that can advocate for like, guys, it actually, if you make it so we can't live, the writing is going to suffer and you're going to make less money, and almost like save Hollywood from itself.
Yeah, or in a weird way, like kind of like saves capitalism from itself, maybe. I don't know. It's interesting. It is just kind of, I mean, you've really summed it up, but I think you could see this in kind of all creative industries. And I think that like a really kind of macro overarching point is that if you give tax credits to developers in like cities and all the DIY venues and small little like
Sure.
mid-sized venues go away, then like where the fuck are like the bands playing? And then like you don't have a cultural music scene. And then like even then, like how are you selling those shitty condos? You know, but it's just like it kind of goes back to all this, and it's like capitalism continues to just fucking like churn along and gobble up and like, you know, eat everything in its path. But like if you don't make it so that like an artist can make a living, or in this case, like say like a writer, or even like an actor. I mean, like I'm not gonna name names, but like I know actors in New York who booked gigs on these streaming services, shows that were produced by these streaming services. They got a big paycheck. 2 years later, they're back working in a bar in the service industry because there's no residuals, and it's like expensive to live in New York. But that's what the industry is. You know, this is just one example, you know, but I think the overarching point the macro point I'm trying to make is that like, you need to kind of create these spaces that like allow artists to live and work and showcase and try stuff out with trial and error. And I mean, there's a great newsletter that we can go ahead and post, in the show notes, by Matt Stoller, that kind of details the reason why we've gotten to this point and the history of it that we won't go into now. You know, there's a series of like laws that were enacted and the laws were stripped away, and like, you know, new technologies and everything. But yeah, if you're going to maintain those spaces and that ability to kind of continue to create like good culture and to continue to like allow for experimentation and all that, then like, where's that going to come from? And unfortunately with like music, I don't know what your opinion is, but it's really difficult when there's no union. But here you have like Hollywood actually like putting up that fight, and it's like kind of happening like right now, like at the negotiating table. I mean, I don't even know if they are negotiating. There was like a terrible, one of the unnamed producer wrote an op-ed and like published it in Variety or something about how like the idea was they're just going to make all the writers like bleed dry until they can't pay their rent, and then they'll like come back to work or some horrific thing like that. It's amazing when these fucking C-suite people just show their fucking cards like that. But yeah, the overarching point is like, you know, how much will this actually move the needle and change things? Like, I don't know, but it's kind of like, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but it feels like it's kind of like the front line, but maybe the only line, really.
Yeah. And I'm kind of sitting here thinking again about music, whether this is a result of like historical contingency, or whether there's like a specific elements in the way music is produced that make this kind of unionization more difficult. Because sure, you can say like, oh, musicians are flaky, but like I don't think that's it. And clearly there have been like UMA and other current unionization efforts, but like SAG-AFTRA, equity for like stage actors, like those are like for real unions. IATSE, which is the stagehand and like grip technical union, and like in music, clearly like for shows, like there are Teamsters there 100%, but like they're kind of considered very separate from the music industry. And like one of the things I'm thinking about is specifically like at a performance level, one of the huge differences, it seems to me, is the like the kind of communal or interactive nature of a lot of performance, like movie performance, right? Like you're a musician. Maybe you are in a band before you have a solo act, but like mostly like you have a project, and that project kind of lives or dies on its own. Whereas even famous actors, like they usually start off as small roles in broader things, which means that the kinds of protection that a union gives them did help them at one point in their career, and that they worked within a union structure at one point in their career. And so that when they got big, there's like, they had that experience. They're already a union member, which is like an important thing. Like, you know, freedom of choice. It's this funny thing about unions. It's like they have to compel belonging to them in order to get the kind of power to negotiate with bosses. So like one level, they're already union members, but also like every famous actor, I'd imagine, has had the experience of playing a small part and like getting union scale wages, and that being way better than not getting union scale wages in a way that musicians no longer do. At the same time, some of this, and this, there's some scholarship on this that I think we should probably do a whole episode about at some point, is like there was a big break in the 60s for a lot of different reasons. But like the move to rock music did a lot to undermine music unions, right? Like the jazz players in New York a lot of times had to be union members in order to play those clubs. But once you get into this like new left adjacent radical rock music scene where they're like the unions are old and they're stuffy and they're like forces of oppression, which in many ways they were in the 60s, right? These unions are like sclerotic and very racist often and like opposed to pro-Vietnam and opposed to all kinds of radical changes, very anti-democratic. They really like cut the legs out from under it. Also like the idea that you're writing your own music as the kind of default assumption means that, again, the kinds of collaborative elements that used to like that Tin Pan Alley or the Brill Building, or even like actually how pop songwriting functions now, like those songwriters don't have the same kind of cohesive power. Songwriters is interesting. I could imagine songwriting unionized, but you'd have to find a way to force it on record labels and performers. And it's, you know, it's kind of nice that battle was won in the New Deal era. It's a lot easier to have already unionized a place than to unionize it for the first time. So yeah,
I mean, all we need to do is just look at these like singular Amazon distribution centers that are trying to unionize, and the amount of struggle and pushback they get for just like and that's not even like all Amazon workers. That's just like a single warehouse. So yeah, for me, I think that because of consolidation and like just how like massively strong these, you know, major labels or the, you know, these studios in regards to Hollywood are, it's just so difficult to imagine in music them being able to unionize any kind of mass scale, just considering the amount of like resources and power that, you know, not to mention, we've talked about this a little bit before, but not to mention it'd be kind of hard to maybe get Drake on board. And, you know, I mean, and I don't know, I think it would have to be a strike maybe from the sort of studio musicians and the songwriters and like the producers, you know, for like hip hop producers and things like that. It'd have to be coming from them.
And the producers union idea.
Yeah, and
I love
like,
that idea.
Yeah, and then like, especially if you look at a place like, if you look at the model in regards to Nashville, where it's like a lot of the country singers, I think Morgan Wallen does write a lot of his own music, but like, you know, like a Morgan Wallen, like don't write their music at all. If like, you know, I could see it starting in Nashville. If all the like, you know, if all the writers like just decided to just collab, I mean, it'd be hard to get them together, but if they all just decided to like stop writing, I mean, country music would come to a fucking grinding halt. And like, as we saw going back to the first part of the show, as we saw in that mid-year music report, like country music is huge right now. So, but yeah, it is still hard to sort of like imagine it. But I mean, I could see it. I could see a similar path, even despite not having the union. If you had like enough songwriters at least, and enough studio musicians that were, you know, big names and like had some sway. But you know, I don't know if they. Well, anyways, that you know, that I think that I could see that happening in a similar fashion that we're seeing in Hollywood. But you know, it's I think it's much more of an uphill battle than even what Hollywood has. And I think that the Hollywood writers and the actors that do have quite a battle in front of them. I mean, it's going on for 2 months now. And I think that also we have to consider like also that there are a lot of sort of lower level workers who are out of work now. And like, you know, having spent a lot of time like living in Atlanta, you know, I've seen it and I've heard about it that PAs and things like that are like getting jobs at cafes now because they just can't, there's no work. Yeah. Yeah. So keeping those people on board and like having them understand like the like long-term advantages of that. I mean, it's not going to like fracture the union, but I don't know. It could start to create some sort of possible internal strife. Yeah. But yeah, I guess we'll just be kind of watching this space, but you know, surprise, surprise, people, like, these like tech companies completely upending an industry, and now here we are left with the dregs of it, and it's actually ruined everything. What a fucking surprise! No way! Like we never talk about this kind of shit on this episode on this podcast. Like
yeah, no, it for me it's just a sense of like when we talk about the coming changes in And maybe this is a little bit grim, but right, like when we talk about the coming changes they're going to happen in relationship to AI, in relationship to new models of commoditization, I can't help but be struck by the ways in which, and again, like they're very different industries. Kind of going off what you were saying, like for me, it seems like union activity tends to work when there's a choke point, like, so like stopping production is something you can do. It's kind of hard to stop production. In some ways, a similar choke point in music, though, again, scattered across a bunch of different things, is like these big tours, right, that are increasingly vital for record industries, vital for the music industry in general, where like stopping one or threatening to stop one, then you're talking about a production that operates on a somewhat similar scale to a big budget movie, right? Stopping a bunch of club shows or like one album being rolled out doesn't have this give you the same kind of leverage, I don't think. But yeah, just a sense of like how different these negotiations can be when you have another voice. When you have a seat at the table, right?
Yeah, no, completely. And I mean, and the thing is, like, I think that like maybe a point, that the importance of that is so important. And I'm sitting here thinking about how this is like such like a key pivotal moment, because I mean, I'm just trying to like game it out into the future, right? And I'm thinking that like if this if this strike hadn't happened for like another 5 years, right? Like with AI and the power of AI and everything, it would only be that much stronger. And I mean, I think that that's the real existential threat that maybe, we should also emphasize to sort of wrap up this second half, is that as AI gets stronger, I never thought about this, but it's like it kind of weakens, or could possibly weaken, the leverage that writers, actors, particularly producers and songwriters, have at that table when they're trying to negotiate contracts or trying to negotiate like, a union deal. Because like at some point, maybe the AI will be so strong then like, basically the major labels will be like, oh, you don't want to write, okay, we'll flip the fucking AI switch and they'll write it'll write the music. I mean, that's yet to be seen, but yeah, it
won't be as good, but it'll be passable.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so yeah. I think that's one of the things behind this strike, is a sense that like you do it now and set the rules, or else if you don't set the rules will get set for you.
Exactly. Well, we'll end on that point, and we'll definitely be watching what happens. Music by Bird Language. We apologize for the sort of delay. Sam was in Japan, which maybe he'll mention in a future episode, but we'll be back soon. Thanks for listening. Bye.